Hello, Saints. Tonight I want to speak to you about the subject of our love being made perfect. I know we've all heard of that over the years, how that perfect love casts out fear. And we want to find out how that's done tonight. Are you aware of the context of when the Apostle John spoke about our love being made perfect? What was he talking about? So let's go right into the Word tonight. And that'll be 1 John. We'll start there, and it'll be chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. And the apostle gives us the following truth. And we have known and believed the love that God has to us. God is love, and he that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God, and God in him. Herein is our love made perfect. So that's what this is going to be all about. Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment. Because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, because perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love. So when we hear the phrase that perfect love casts out fear, we see that what John is actually talking about is the day of judgment. And in the context, he puts it like this. In verse 17, in this, or herein, is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment. Because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love. So the thing that he's trying to get across to us here is that if our love is perfect, we can have boldness in the day of judgment. But if our love is not perfect, we're going to have fear and torment. So how can our love be made perfect? Because that's what we want. Perfect love casts out fear. And what it's talking about is concerning where will we stand on the day of judgment. It's not just talking about calming all of the fears that you have that you go through in life, friends. That's where people have missed it on this. They don't understand that the context is the day of judgment. Now he says that anyone whose love is made perfect, they're going to have boldness on the day of judgment. Then he puts it like this, because as he is, so are we in this world. So that, friends, is how we can have boldness, is by being like Jesus. So what does that have to do with our love being made perfect? Well, John tells us in his writing here in the same book, in 1 John chapter 2, John actually explains how our love is made perfect. 1 John chapter 2 and starting in verse 3. And hereby we do know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He that says, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But now look at this, because here is the key to understanding whether we will have boldness or whether we will have fear on the day of judgment, and how that we can overcome that fear, how we can cause our love to be made perfect so it will cast out the fear. And again, see, we've got to understand that the fear he's talking about here is the fear of standing in the day of judgment. That's what he's talking about. When he says perfect love casts out fear, he's talking about fear, not of just the average things of life, but fear that someone would have on the day of judgment. And now here, friends, is the answer to how our love is made perfect. He says, whoso keepeth his word, in him verily is the love of God perfected. See, this is how our love is made perfect, is that we keep his word. Now, you're not normally being told this, because people usually have it out of context. They want you to think that Well, if you are nice, that's the way they usually define being perfect, or your love being perfect. Like if you're nice, then that niceness will just cast out all of the fears that you have in life. But see, that's not with the context of what John is speaking about. The context is obviously the day of judgment. We can either have boldness in the day of judgment, or we'll have fear and torment in the day of judgment. And the point is how we can have perfect love, because he says perfect love casts out fear. So here we're showing exactly what the apostle said to do to overcome the fear by making love perfect. He says here in 1 John 2 and verse 5, "Whoso keepeth his word, in him verily is the love of God perfected." So friends, it's by obedience. It's through holiness. It's through that closeness to Jesus, causing you to be obedient to him. And he puts it like this: "Hereby know we that we are in him." See, the reason why that we can have boldness in the day of judgment is because we know that we're in him. We know that we have fellowship with Jesus Christ and we're pleasing to him. See, that's how that we can have perfect love. That's how that we can have boldness in the day of judgment. We won't have anything to fear on that day if we're keeping his word. But friends, if we're not, that's a bad thing. That's a bad sign. And John is trying his best to open our eyes to this and show us how that our love can be made perfect, that we could have boldness in the day of judgment. And it's by keeping his word. See, he says there again in verse 6, "He that saith he abideth in him ought himself also so to walk, even as he walked." Now see, keeping his word is supposed to produce a life where we walk even as he walked. See, that's how our love is made perfect. Let's check that again with the first scriptures that we were looking at, because our purpose is that we want to cast out fear, right? John said in 1 John 4:18, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear." Well, that same apostle tells us how our love is made perfect, doesn't he? In 1 John 2 verse 5, "Whoever keeps his word, in him the love of God is perfected." So when he says perfect love casts out fear, he's talking about the kind of love where we're keeping his commandments. See, it casts out fear, meaning the fear of the day of judgment. We don't have to fear the day of judgment because we're keeping his commandments. Our love, which is being made perfect by obedience, keeps us from the fear, and it actually gives us boldness in the day of judgment. We don't have to go to the day of judgment with fear and torment, wondering whether or not we're going to make it. No, friends. We can go before the day of judgment with all confidence. And that's the true meaning when the Apostle John talks about perfect love casting out fear. It's talking about at the day of judgment. We can either have boldness or we can have fear on the day of judgment. But again, look at what he says here in chapter 4 and verse 17. "Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world." Now, isn't that saying that if we're like Jesus, then we'll have boldness in the day of judgment? Well, yes, that's exactly what it's saying. If we're like Jesus, we can have boldness in the day of judgment. And that agrees with what the apostle said in 1 John 2 and verse 6 when he said, "He that says he abides in him ought to walk even as he walked." So if we keep his commandments, that means that we're walking as he walked, and that means that we're as he is. Like John said, that because as he is, so are we in this world. So friends, that's how we will have boldness in the day of judgment, because we're like Jesus. We walk as He walked. But if we're not walking that way, then we'll have fear and torment on that day, because we'll know, our very conscience will testify against us that we're not keeping His commandments, that we're not living as He lived. So really, that's the true context of when John said that perfect love casts out fear. It's talking about the day of judgment, and it's saying that if we keep His commandments, that we're made perfect in love. See, it's not just about being nice to people. It's about keeping the commandments of Jesus Christ. If we do that, then He says that we're made perfect in love, and that's how to do it. That's how we're made perfect in love, is by keeping His word. Now, of course, part of His word is to be kind to people, of course, but there's far more to it than that. But if we keep His commandments, we'll be like Him. And it says then we can have boldness in the day of judgment, because as He is, so are we in this world. And that casts out fear from us. We no longer fear standing at the judgment, but rather we'll have boldness. We'll be glad to stand there, because we know that everything is okay between us and Jesus. One more verse also in 1 John. John says in 1 John 2 and verse 28, really the same thing. And now, little children, abide in Him. Abide in Him. That means live our life in Him. Remain in Him. That when He shall appear, so it's talking about the day of judgment, when He, Jesus, shall appear, we may have confidence. See, that's the same as when He said in 1 John 4, verse 17, that we could have boldness in the day of judgment. He's saying the same thing, just in another way. We can have boldness in the day of judgment. We can have confidence at His appearing. So He's saying the same thing. Little children, abide in Him, that when He shall appear, we may have confidence and not be ashamed before Him at His coming. So it's either boldness or fear. It's either confidence or shame. We'll be one or the other. We will feel one of those two things on the day of judgment. And so if we want to have boldness in the day of judgment, if we want to have confidence at His appearing, what do? Well, we have to make sure that our love is made perfect. And this same apostle tells us exactly how that's done. 1 John 2 and verse 5, allow me to read it again. But whoso keeps His word, in him verily is the love of God perfected. So that phrase is so important, because it's telling us how to do what John is talking about in 1 John 4, 16 through 18. It mentions that little phrase, our love being made perfect, 3 times. I'll go over that real quick. In verse 17, it says, herein is our love made perfect. Then it says in verse 18, perfect love casts out fear. And then it follows that up by saying that he that feareth is not made perfect in love. So the whole idea is to be made perfect in love, right? So then John in 1 John 2:5 tells us exactly how to do that. If we keep His word, we're made perfect in love. And see, that perfect love that we're walking in them casts out fear and torment, because fear and torment has to do with us standing at the judgment if that we're not walking in His word. In other words, we won't have boldness in the day of judgment. We won't have confidence at His appearing, but rather we'll have fear and shame because we haven't been keeping His commandments. So friends, if we meditate on these scriptures and put them together, check them out again when you're done listening to this YouTube video, and I think you'll see what I'm saying, and it can be life-changing, because many people out there don't understand how love is made perfect. And John tells us, keeping His commandments. If we keep His commandments, our love is made perfect. Then we have boldness and confidence at the day of judgment. But if we don't, we'll have fear, we'll have shame. We won't be prepared to stand before Him on that day. So I love you, friends, and hope that you'll get something out of this. Praise the Lord.